Okay, so this is an abridged version of a paper that I wrote for a volume that's coming out, published by Paul Copan and Chris Date. It's a 2 Views on Hell volume, and they asked a series of scholars to look at sort of philosophical, theological, exegetical angles on it, and I was asked to write on the philosophical side of it in dialogue with another philosopher called Zachary Manis. And the original paper was quite large. It was close to 8,000 words. I thought that was probably too long, so I've sort of abridged it down, cut it down to parts that I thought might interest you. Some of this material I've presented at different points in the past. Some of you may have heard bits and pieces of it and different things I've presented at different times. But I thought I'd present it to you. I'm also aware that the association has from time to time funded things I've done, so I thought it would be useful to give you an overview of some of the research I've published in recent years, so you kind of see the fruits of connections and work that I've done and what have you. Okay. So the traditional conception of hell contends that the punishment awaiting the finally impenitent is conscious torment, everlasting conscious torment. Punishment at hell is considered to be eternal, according to the traditional view, because the torment lasts forever. By contrast, evangelical annihilationists maintain that this is contrary to Scripture. They claim that the punishment of hell is total and irreversible destruction. Hell is eternal in the sense that it is a total and irreversible destruction. The penalty inflicted in hell is death. It's permanent. One is dead forever, never resurrected or reincarnated. Now, this debate is mainly exegetical. It focuses on the meaning of biblical words and phrases such as eternal life, eternal destruction, death, perish, eternal punishment, unquenchable fire, second death, destroy body and soul, lake of fire, smoke of their torment, weeping and gnashing of teeth, and so on and so on and so forth, right? Traditionalists argue that these phrases refer to everlasting torment or a picture of everlasting torment or something like that. And annihilationists argue that in the context they refer to metaphors for destruction, perishing, that sort of thing. Now, I think the exegetical debate is extremely important. I think it is the most important part of the debate. As someone who studies as a Christian philosopher, I think my job is to explore the implications of what the apostles taught and defend what the apostles taught, not to make models contrary to it or speculations that go beyond it. So I think the exegetical debate is important. However, sometimes philosophical considerations are raised which turn on these issues, or where, in addition to these issues. So in his famous dialogue with a liberal theologian, John Stott argued that annihilationism is better able to address various moral and philosophical challenges to the doctrine of hell. And I've got a quote there at the very start where John Stott says that. He says, "Would there not be serious disproportion between sins consciously committed in time and torment consciously experienced throughout eternity? I do not minimize the gravity of sin as rebellion against God our Creator, and shall return to it shortly. But I question whether eternal conscious torment is compatible with the biblical revelation of divine justice." Now, Stott here refers to a very common sort of moral or philosophical objection to the doctrine of hell, and he suggests that annihilationism has a better job of answering this moral problem than the traditional view. And this is what I really want to explore in the talk that I'm giving this morning, and this is what I explore in the article in the volume that I referred to. And to do that, I want to do sort of 2 things. Firstly, I want to look at a representative objection, a representative version of this objection. So I'm going to look at a objection to Christian doctrine raised by the atheist philosopher Raymond Bradley, and he puts forward an argument that the doctrine of hell is just immoral and we should reject Christianity because of this doctrine. Okay? And then I want to look at the response of the Christian philosopher who's a traditionalist, William Lane Craig, and how he addresses this challenge. And I'm going to say some things about the response he gives. And then I want to contrast it with how I think an annihilationist would address this challenge. Okay? And the point of this is to show that in the context when we're presenting the gospel or we're putting forward what the apostles taught, people are going to push back. People are going to raise objections to what we as Christians believe. And I think sometimes clarifying what the Bible teaches, clarifying what the doctrine of final punishment actually is, and how it can answer some of these questions can be useful. Right. So let's dive in. So let's look. So let's start off. I'm going to look at a critique of hell raised by the philosopher Raymond Bradley. He was an emeritus professor, I think, from in a university in Canada, and he was also a professor at Auckland University. So Raymond Bradley basically argues that Christian theism, that is belief, Christian doctrine, is logically inconsistent. And his argument really involves 3 steps. And this first step is basically exegetical. He refers to various passages in both the Gospel of Matthew and the Book of Revelation. And the passages in the Book of Revelation are passages about the lake of fire, which refers to the beast and the false prophet and Satan and the finally impenitent being tormented with sulphur and fire, and the smoke of their torment going up forever and ever, Revelation 14. And he also references various passages in the Gospel of Matthew, which refer to fire, unquenchable fire, weeping of gnashing of teeth, fiery furnace, etc., right? And he takes it that these passages teach that God will punish people for their sins by torturing them or tormenting them forever. So he takes that as what these passages teach. His second point is a little bit abstract, and this is a conceptual point. And this is in the quote there on the handout. He says, if we were to describe a person as perfectly good, then we commit ourselves to saying that he or she doesn't act in the kind of ways that evil people do. Fair enough? It follows further that if we were to describe someone as Hitler as perfectly good, despite all his evil doings, we'd be playing word games that are intellectually dishonest as they are morally pernicious. Needless to say, this principle applies just as much when describing God as it does when describing Hitler. And the point Bradley makes here is this, is you can't say God is good and then just attribute anything at all to what God does. Mm-hmm. Right, that's the point he's making. Words like good, justice, merciful are not terms that can just mean anything at all if they are to have any meaning at all. They are concepts that we are familiar with, we use, and there are limits to how far you can stretch their meaning before what you were saying is just incoherent nonsense or word games. And I noticed this one time because I've had dialogues with Christians from time to time where people will sometimes say something like, well, you know, God can do whatever he likes, he is God and he is just. And there's a sense in which that is true, but there's also a sense in which if you're going to say God is loving and God is just, you're committed to say God acts in a way that is loving and God acts in a way that is just. And if that can mean just anything, then the question comes, what do you actually mean when you're saying something is loving and something is just? And this is the point Bradley is trying to make. That those terms, if they have some meaning, you can't just fill that meaning up with anything. And I'll give you an example that might illustrate this. Let's suppose I ran into a community of people and I heard that they used this word water. And I said to them, what do you use that word to refer to? And they said, well, we use it to refer to red stuff in volcanoes. Right? I would conclude that they were using the word water to refer to lava. Right? That's what I would conclude, right? I would say, okay, they're not really talking about water, they're talking about lava. They're using the word water to refer to lava, right? If they're going to be talking about water, then I would expect them to start talking about the same kinds of things that I'm talking about when I use the word water, right? And that's Bradley's point here. The words, Christians believe God has certain character traits. We believe God is truthful, that he's merciful, that he's just, and these words can't just mean anything at all, right? Now, we do need to qualify this point somewhat, right? It's true that these words can't just mean anything at all, but there are a couple of things we need to mitigate this with. First, our judgments about what is good and bad are fallible. While God is perfectly good, it's quite plausible that his mercy and justice and love may differ in some ways from what we mistakenly think is merciful, loving and just, right? If we say otherwise, we're assuming that we are such good judges of morality that God would never disagree with us, and that's implausible, right? So, second, our opinions about what is good and what is just are subject to revision. We debate about them, we change our opinion from time to time, and we do this without playing word games or changing the meaning of what we say and so on. If we couldn't do this, we could never sensibly change our mind on an issue. So Bradley's argument does not show that we are unable to attribute to God actions that go somewhat contrary to our moral beliefs or our conceptions of morality or justice. But his point is that we can't coherently attribute to God actions that are too much at variance with our common sense conceptions of justice, love, mercy, and so on, right? What God does will probably be somewhat different to that, and he might do things that are surprising to us and might differ with our preconceived concepts of those things to some extent. But there's a limit to how far we can push that. Right? There's a limit to how far we can push that before we're changing the subject. Right. So following the philosophers in Bagot and Wells, I would distinguish between what we call negotiable and non-negotiable moral beliefs. Okay? The latter, non-negotiable moral beliefs, are those beliefs which are unable to be relinquished, not just psychologically, but rationally, without perverting morality itself. In other words, you can't contribute to God actions entailing a non-negotiable moral belief without really changing the subject about what you're talking about. Right? You would be attributing to him, you would be rejecting something so integral to our understanding of morality and justice that you're really giving up on talking about morality and justice, and you're really talking about something else and just using the word justice to refer to it. Right? You understand what I'm saying when I say that, right? So I'll give you an example. Suppose someone said to me, God is good. He commands us to kill everyone around us purely for entertainment and wants us to inflict as much suffering on people all the time for no reason at all, right? Well, if someone said that, we would think that was nonsense, right? We wouldn't sort of say, oh, that's an interesting concept of goodness, or say, no, that's not a concept of goodness at all, right? That person doesn't understand what goodness is if they think something like that, right? Similarly, if someone said, God will torture all innocent people for eternity for excruciating pain for no reason at all, and he's just. Right? Well, if he treats innocent people that way, that would seem that he's not just, right? So accepting claims like this would be a rejection of a non-negotiable moral belief. By contrast, I think there are claims about love and justice that many people in our society accept that we can coherently attribute to God without, forcing a radical vision of this sort. So here's an example. In our society today, there is a debate amongst contemporary philosophers over whether capital punishment is just. Many people in our society today think that executing someone is always unjust. And there are some intelligent people who debate otherwise. Now, I think an opponent of capital punishment could examine the arguments on this issue, change his mind, and I wouldn't think that he was denying a non-negotiable moral belief. I wouldn't think that he was suddenly adopting some view of morality that meant he was changing the subject. And I think cross-culturally, many Westerners make claims about justice which other cultures disagree with. In the West, many people have a trivial attitude towards sexual indiscretions, for example, and are opposed to the harsher penalties meted out in some non-Western countries. But I don't think that our convictions about these things are so deeply entrenched and integral to our understanding of justice that we would have to say, well, look, these people don't understand what justice is. When they're talking about justice, they're talking about a different subject. We'd have to say that they just have we have a disagreement as to what justice is. And it seems to me we need to be open to the idea that we might be wrong about those things, and that it's possible God's stance on some of those things, or God's position on some of those things, may differ from our preconceived notions. So I think we're open to the idea that God's understanding of justice may be different to ours, but there's a limit to how far we can push it, right? And we cannot attribute to God anything that goes contrary to a non-negotiable moral belief. And this is Bradley's second point, his conceptual point. You can see where he's going with this, right? And so then Bradley goes on to say he's got these two non-negotiable moral beliefs. In fact, in his article he has several. I'm just going to focus, or have narrowed them down to two. And he thinks these two things on the page there, A and B, are non-negotiable moral beliefs. So A is, a perfectly good being would not torture anyone for any period whatever, however brief. And the second one, B, is a just being wouldn't punish anyone eternally for the sins committed during a brief lifetime, but would proportion the punishment to the offence. So if you accept his exegetical conclusions, then you'd have to say that God acts contrary to these alleged non-negotiable beliefs. And then if you accept his conceptual claim, you'd have to say that this means that Christians are talking nonsense when they say that God is just and God is loving, because they're committed to a conception of God which says that he acts contrary to non-negotiable moral beliefs, right? That's the kind of argument that he lays out. And I put that there because it's a fairly standard or common way a secular philosopher, a secular atheist philosopher would criticise a Christian understanding of hell, right? So that's what Raymond Bradley argues. So one of the leading defenders of Christian theism, Christian philosophers today, is William Lane Craig. And William Lane Craig has written and spoken a lot on this response, on this argument, and he has in fact responded directly to Raymond Bradley. And he responds to both these points. And he responds both to the claim that the New Testament teaches beliefs contrary to A and to B. So let's look at his response. So Craig's response to A is interesting. This is what he says. He says, the word torture is pejorative. The question is whether a perfectly good being would punish someone for any period of time. The answer is, of course he would. if he wouldn't be perfectly good if he wouldn't, right? And so notice what Craig does there. He says that these passages, he denies that we should understand God as torturing people. And you might say, but why? What about all those passages that Bradley quotes? Well, Craig thinks that Bradley has given an unfair caricature of the New Testament teaching. So this is what Craig says. Dr. Bradley gave a good deal of quoting the fiery images from the Bible. These are metaphors for eternal separation from God. And it is interesting that Dr. Bradley quoted 2 Thessalonians 1:9 in the article Bradley had originally quoted. He quit reading right in the middle of the verse. The verse goes on to say they shall suffer exclusion from the presence of the Lord, from the glory of his might. And that is the essence of what hell is. It's eternal separation from God, and that is awful. I don't want to minimize it. It is horrible. The metaphors are of flames and weeping and gnashing of teeth are meant to convey what it's like for a person to be lost forever in a world of his own selfish heart, his own selfish desires, away from the source of all love, of all goodness, of all truth. It is terrible. So Craig's first response is to say that, look, if you look at what the New Testament teaches, it doesn't teach that God will torture people in hell. What happens is these biblical references are metaphors for the anguish a person experiences when they are eternally separated from God. And that's a fairly standard traditionalist response. I would suggest it's actually a standard modern traditionalist response, but it's a fairly standard response. Now, I want to say a few things about that response. First, it's unclear to me how a person could, at least if you're speaking seriously here, literally, really be eternally, everlastingly separated from God, away from the source of all love, goodness and truth, and continue to exist. If you think about this, right? If God is omnipresent, and God is the creator and sustainer of all things apart from himself, if you really are eternally separated from God in any realistic sense, you don't exist, right? You would be annihilated, right? To really be eternally separated from God would entail annihilation. The only way you could be conscious and separated from God is if you're not actually separated from God in some sense of that word, right? So there's a sense of what are you talking about here? Not when you're talking about eternally separated from God and in existence, right? Secondly, he talks about the fiery images in question being metaphorical. Now, in my original article, I've said a lot more about this, but I was told to cut the exegesis out and focus on the philosophy by the editor, so I cut them out. But I'll just say this, is you can't just say biblical texts are metaphors for X, Y, Z. You have to look at the text. You have to justify that by looking at the text and their context, how the texts are used in that particular literary genre and what have you. And I would argue that if you carefully exegese the relevant passages, they are metaphors, but they're metaphors for annihilation. So just give you a few throwaway examples. The phrase unquenchable fire does not refer to a fire that burns forever, but if you look at how it's used throughout the Old Testament, it is always used for a fire that burns out completely because it consumes what it burns. It's commonly used, it's a common phrase throughout the Old Testament, and that is how it is always used. And similarly, when you look at some of the other metaphors Craig uses, the fiery images, they're usually images of things like bushes burning up or trees burning up, etc. And I went through this in much more detail in the article, but like I said, I have to cover that. But the most relevant point here is this. If these metaphors are meant to communicate everlasting agony of being separated from God, then Bradley's challenge remains unanswered. And here's why. Craig interprets the relevant metaphors as referring to the psychological anguish a person experiences when separated from God. If these metaphors function this way, the psychological suffering that a person suffers when separated from God must be like the suffering you experience when you are burning forever. That's the point of the metaphor, right? And this anguish must be significant. And Craig himself says it's significant. In fact, elsewhere in the article he says it is far worse than the people experienced at the Nazi death camps. Now, if this is true, then hell does involve the infliction of torture. And here's a point that Westerners need to get their head around. Torture is not limited to the infliction of physical pain. Right? Effective as torturers can and do subject their torturers to psychological suffering. Solitary confinement is banned under certain conventions on torture because solitary confinement causes severe psychological suffering to human beings, to lock a human being up by themselves, permanently isolated from any other person, is a form of torture. It is a severe form of psychological torture that is banned under various conventions. Punishments that subject people to severe psychological suffering count as torture, just as much as physical pain does. So, while I respect Craig as a scholar, it seems to me he wants to have his cake and eat it too here. He's saying on the one hand that the metaphors of being tortured are apt metaphors for what suffering, the anguish of being separated from God is like, but it's nothing like torture. No? But if they're metaphors for that, they must be like torture. That's what a metaphor is, right? A metaphor is, this is like being tortured. That's exactly how a metaphor functions, right? A metaphor is when you say this is what this is like, you know.
So that's like if you send that naughty kid away into their bedroom because they've been so bad, you're not actually hitting them, but it's pretty horrible for them.
Well, there's a point in which psychological suffering can be just as bad, if not worse, than physical suffering. Right? And I'll get into this point a little bit later. There's another point where I make that later on, where I get into more detail. Okay, what about Bradley's second claim, B, that a just being would not punish someone eternally for the sins committed during a brief lifetime, but would proportion the punishment to the offence? Now, this alludes to what is sometimes called the disproportionality challenge, and I've spelled it out for you just so you can see all the steps of it, because you kind of need to see those steps when I go through and analyse the responses to it. So the disproportionality challenge is spelt out this way, and I've got it there spelt out. P stands for premise, that's kind of like a step in the argument, and C stands for a conclusion, that's like an inference someone draws from the step. So this is how the problem is supposed to work. A just person endorses a punishment only if the severity of the punishment is proportionate to the seriousness of the crime. P2. No human sin or brief human lifetime of sinning can be infinite and serious. P3. Hell is an everlasting punishment. P4. God punishes humans with hell for the sins they commit during a brief lifetime. And so then the conclusion is, to punish sins humans commit in a brief lifetime with hell is to punish those sins disproportionately, and that's supposed to follow from the premise 2 and premise 3, and therefore a just person would not endorse punishing the sins humans commit in a brief lifetime with hell, and so then therefore the conclusion is supposed to be that God is not a just person. Okay? Now notice, this particular line of argument doesn't rely on the idea that hell involves torture, it only relies on the idea that hell is everlasting. Right? And that's important, we'll get to that a bit later. Now Craig's response to this is really interesting. This is what he says. If you find this objection persuasive, you can avoid it by adopting the doctrine of annihilationism. I'm not of this opinion myself, but it does represent a way you can escape the problem. Right? So the first thing to say here is everything he says is based on, so he basically says, look, if you adopt annihilationism, you get out of the problem, but I'm not going to do that. So I think that's an interesting concession. Why doesn't he adopt annihilationism? He says it's difficult to square with the biblical data, which represent hell as everlasting punishment, and he quotes two passages, Matthew 25:46 and Thessalonians 1:9, both of which refer to final punishment as everlasting. Matthew 25 refers to eternal punishment, and 2 Thessalonians 1:9 refers to eternal destruction. So both use the word eternal to refer to the final punishment of as eternal, as refer to it as eternal. Right? So what does Craig do then if Craig doesn't take annihilationism? Well, his first response is to deny premise 4. He says, even if God does not allow a finite punishment for every sin, and this again is on the page there, since the denizens of hell continue to hate and reject God, they continue to sin and so accrue to themselves more punishment, so that both sinning and punishment go on forever. So notice on this view, evil is never defeated. Evil and sin continue for eternity. It's a brief side note, but anyway. People thus don't receive eternal conscious punishment for the sins committed in a brief lifetime. Instead, they receive it for the infinite number of sins they continue to commit for all eternity. All right, so the idea is this is right. His second response is to attack the second premise, and he suggests that the sin of rejecting God himself, is a sin of infinite gravity in proportion, so plausibly merits infinite punishment. So in this view, people are not condemned eternally for sins, what he refers to as sins of finite consequence, such as theft or lying and adultery. Instead, they are eternally punished just for the sin of infinite consequence, that is the sin of rejecting God himself, which decisively separates you from God. So that's what Craig's response to the problem is. So I want you to notice something here, right? So Craig concedes that annihilationism addresses the problem. So he thinks, philosophically annihilationism is sound. His deficiency, however, is exegetical. He thinks, well, look, it denies that punishment is everlasting, and it contradicts these biblical passages. So I'm going to argue that both those claims are false. All right. So firstly, is annihilation and everlasting punishment? Okay. So this point is a little bit subtle, and I think once you kind of recognise it, it's a bit of an eye-opener. It certainly was when I realised it. But this is about the word punishment. The Oxford English Dictionary defines the word punishment as follows. Right? The infliction of a penalty or sanction in retribution for an offence or transgression, that's one distinction, or that which is inflicted as a penalty, a sanction imposed to ensure the application or enforcement of a law. I'll read that again, listen. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, there are two meanings to the word punishment. The infliction, the act of inflicting a penalty or sanction in retribution for an offence or transgression, or that which is inflicted as a penalty, a sanction imposed. So there are two meanings to the word punishment in English, right? It can refer to the activity of inflicting a penalty, or to the resultant penalty or sanction that has been inflicted, right? Now, annihilationists argue that the biblical phrase eternal punishment should be interpreted in the second of these senses, right? It is teaching that the penalty, the resultant penalty that has been inflicted, is everlasting. The penalty is death, is the second death, and it is everlasting. Someone loses their life in the second death, they never give it back. That penalty lasts forever and is irrevocable. And so annihilationism doesn't teach that punishment is not eternal, right? Once you understand what is meant by the word punishment, they understand punishment has this ambiguity in English. Once you understand how that's understood, that's not what annihilationists teach. Now, despite this, Sean, how do you pronounce his name here, Glenn? Bawulski. I never know how to pronounce the name. Bawulski has argued that annihilationism should not be understood as everlasting punishment. I want to address this a little bit because this comes up sometimes when people have to sign statements of belief. So sometimes people sign statements of belief and they say, I believe in everlasting punishment, and then they are annihilationists and they get in trouble. Or they go to a university and they have to sign up to a belief statement that says, I believe in everlasting punishment, and they sign up and they get in trouble. And so I think it's important that we can be quite clear on how to defend this, right? So Sean Bawulski has argued that annihilationism should not be considered an everlasting punishment. And this is the argument he gives. He says, someone who has been annihilated cannot experience the penalty or sanction imposed upon them. To be counted as a punishment, he argues, what is inflicted in hell must be experienced. And he gives this example. It's hard to see how we might punish an offender who is in a coma, especially if that coma is irreversible. Okay? So what do I say in response to that? Well, firstly, I think he's right that you couldn't punish someone who is already in an irreversible coma. But this doesn't show that a penalty must always be experienced to count as punishment. And to see this, imagine a different case. Suppose someone, let's call him John, engages in a murder spree. He's arrested, sentenced to death, and let's say he's put into, before they execute him, before they say behead him, they put him under general anaesthesia so that he's unconscious, and then they cut his head off. Right? Has he been sentenced to death? Has he been executed? It seems to me that he has been. Has he been punished? Seems to me he has been. Right? Why? Well, a significant loss has been imposed upon him. He's been deprived of his future life, right? The life he would have lived if he had not been executed. His life's been snuffed out, right? He's been killed, right? Right? So it seems that this Bawulski's argument here is just wrong, right? Paradigmatically, when people are killed, they are harmed. But they are harmed because they lose their lives. Now, think about this. They're not harmed because they lose their past life, right? When you're killed, you don't lose your past life. And they're not harmed because they lose the instantaneous present. What one loses when one is killed is one's future life, the life one would have otherwise gone on to live and enjoy. Now, if you were already in an irreversible coma, the reason it seems implausible that you can be punished is because you lack any kind of valuable future life that you could enjoy anyway, right? So no loss can really be envisioned as a penalty upon you. Right? The situation, however, that the annihilationist talks about is quite different. On the annihilationist view of eschatology, the alternative to annihilation is everlasting life, right? So the alternatives are either being destroyed or living in eternity, in bliss, in everlasting life. And so therefore being finally killed in that context, you're being deprived of a very, very valuable future. It's totally different to being punished when you're already in an irreversible coma, right? It's a fundamentally different situation. So it seems to me this analogy just doesn't work, right? Now, Borowski goes on to give a slightly different argument. He refers to several biblical texts that describe the reprobate as aware of and experiencing the punishment that is meted out on them. And so he thinks, hell must in some sense be experienced. But it seems to me that this, again, doesn't seem to me to be a plausible argument. After all, annihilationists believe the wages of sin is death. God will destroy both the body and soul in hell. And it seems to me that typically when someone is executed, they do experience something, right? Suppose you were executed to die by electric chair or hanging or firing squad. It's quite plausible to say that you're going to experience that to some extent, right? It's true, once you're dead, you'll experience nothing, but you will still, the process of being sentenced and executed and what have you, will often be something you experience, right? And it's often not a very pleasant experience. It's often terrifying, and so on. Okay. Now, Borowski does offer some sort of pushback to that. And he sort of says, look, the death sentence is different because the Christian doctrine of universal resurrection means that the state implemented capital punishment is not a personal annihilation, it's just an ending of this life. But I don't think that makes any difference in this context, because whether you rise again from the dead makes no difference to whether a capital offender experiences something when he's executed, and it doesn't make any difference to whether or not we consider what happens to him to be a punishment. So suppose that God decided not to raise Ted Bundy from the dead. Okay? Does it follow that Ted Bundy experienced nothing when he was executed? And does it follow that Ted Bundy was not punished? No, it doesn't seem to me that's correct. So it seems Ted Bundy has still received the penalty of death no matter what God does on the resurrection day. Ted Bundy's execution involved a process, he experienced it, and Ted Bundy was punished. Borowski offers a second argument, which he goes as follows. He says, most annihilationists claim that annihilation does not occur at physical death, or even immediately after the final judgment, but posit a finite period of conscious punishment leading up to the final annihilation. The problem then is this: the only penal aspect related to annihilation is the dreadful application of the upcoming annihilation. But if the antecedent period of punishment is finite, and the anticipatory period of dread is finite, even if the annihilation is permanent, then the punishment itself must be finite. Okay, so that's what he says. So, and again, this seems to me to be wrong. What he seems to be saying is something like this: the victim of an execution experiences only a finite duration of dread and pain leading up to his death, after which he is unconscious and experiences nothing. And Borowski seems to be suggesting that this means that this finite anticipation and suffering is the only really penal aspect of the punishment that is involved. But that seems to me just implausible. Suppose you were executed by lethal injection in your early 20s. Is it really plausible to suggest that the only penalty you receive is the prick in the arm for a few seconds that you get before you die? Or suppose you are executed in the electric chair. Is it really plausible to suggest that the only punishment administered here is a few seconds of electric shock? It seems implausible. And just to think about this, imagine the person receives the lethal injection, the prick in the arm, and they survive. Do we think the punishment's been carried out? We don't. Which suggests that is not the only penal aspect that has been involved, right? And if you think about somebody who's on death row and they're advocating to get off death row and to have a life sentence instead, are they advocating death row because they don't want to experience 12 seconds of electric shocks, or because they don't want a few seconds of a prick in the arm, or are they up getting a death row because they want their life back? Right? So it seems that Borowski's just wrong here. The fact someone will lose their life, their future life, even though they won't consciously experience the loss of their life, that it's something, is a significant loss to that person. And that is the penal aspect. And we take that very, very, very seriously. We take the fact that we would have had that life had the punishment not been inflicted upon us very, very seriously. So I think that's just a mistake. Okay. So I think it's a mistake to say that annihilationism is not an eternal punishment, right? So what about the biblical data that Craig cites? Well, Craig cites, two passages, Matthew 25:46 and 1 Thessalonians. The key thing to see is these passages do not deny, they are not contrary to annihilationism. So consider these passages. Matthew 25:46 says, "These go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life." Now this passage does not say the experience of being punished is everlasting. It simply says the punishment is everlasting. Like the English word translating it, collasis is a generic term. It can refer to the infliction of pain or to the death penalty. Okay, and the context suggests in this passage that it is something like the death penalty. For one thing, the punishment is contrasted with the reward of everlasting life. So they will go away to everlasting punishment or everlasting life, right? So the contrast is everlasting life or everlasting punishment, right? Moreover, earlier, Jesus has specified the nature of the punishment as one of eternal fire. Now, the word eternal fire occurs only 3 times in the New Testament. The only time its meaning is explained is in Jude 7, where it refers to the punishment that befell the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, which of course was the destruction of those cities, right? It does occur, interestingly enough, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where it is used to refer to annihilation. As I understand it in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I've got the reference down there. As for 2 Thessalonians, notice it's true that the word 1 Thessalonians 1:9 uses the word eternal, but it actually says eternal destruction, right? It uses the word eternal of the word destruction. And it says this will happen when the Lord appears in flaming fire, inflicting vengeance. Now what's interesting is the phrase, when the Lord appears in flaming fire, inflicting vengeance, is a citation from the Septuagint version of Isaiah 66:15. It's the only place these passages occur together. And the passage in Isaiah 66:15 refers to many people being slain and their dead bodies being consumed by fire. Okay, and it's interesting too, when Craig quotes that, he actually quotes from the NIV, which says they will suffer the exclusion away from the presence of the Lord, which is not in the Greek. The Greek just says they will suffer eternal destruction away from the presence of the Lord. Right? And there's nothing about they will suffer the exclusion away from the presence of the Lord. The NIV translators put that in there because it is a possible way of reading the Greek, but it is one possible way of reading the Greek that is disputed.
Do you know what it says in Hebrew?
Oh, the passage in Thessalonians is in Greek. Right?
Yeah, I know, but when the Septuagint...
I don't know what the Hebrew says, no. Paul's writing to the church in Thessalonica, so the relevant reference is...
He's writing in Greek.
Yeah, so the relevant text is actually the Septuagint, because that is the biblical text they would use. Yeah. Okay. All right. So, in fact, there's a certain irony here, because not only do Craig's arguments against annihilationism fail, if you think about it, his endorsement of these arguments makes his own position internally inconsistent. Because he rejects annihilationism because it is inconsistent with these passages. However, these passages, if you read them carefully, contradict Craig's own responses to the problem. Because notice what Matthew 25 says you receive eternal punishment for doing, right? It says you'll receive eternal punishment because you failed to feed the hungry, give water to the thirsty, and give hospitality to the stranger, 41, verse 41, 42, 43, and how they treated the least of these in these life. Notice, those are sins committed in this life, not in the afterlife, and notice they're not the sin of rejecting God. So the two solutions that Craig offered about what you receive eternal punishment for are not in this passage. This passage says you receive eternal punishment for what he calls sins of finite consequence committed in this life, right? Likewise, 2 Thessalonians says that those who do not obey the gospel will suffer the punishment of eternal destruction at Christ's coming. So the disobedience in question is identified with persecuting the church. It's not identified with some future sin in the afterlife, right? And in fact, you can find out references to final punishment being to sins committed in the body. And the point is this. Craig rejects annihilationism because he thinks, look, annihilationism isn't an eternal punishment, and these passages teach that it's an eternal punishment. But then he says, but eternal punishment is for sins committed in the afterlife and only for the sin of rejecting God. But those passages say that eternal punishment is for sins committed in this life and specifies it for sins that are not committing God. All right? So are you going to follow these? Are you going to have a model that's consistent with these texts, aren't you? Right? If annihilationism is going to be rejected because it must conform with these texts, his model must conform with these texts. And if you're free to depart from these texts with speculative models to fit philosophical problems, you can't object to annihilationism doing it. You know? And I think this is actually, I'd say this is a common, I think, in traditionalist literature. As I said, often annihilationism is held to account for an interpretation to the text, and then often there's this kind of freedom to depart from those interpretations later on when they're developing their own models. Okay. So that's my response to Craig and his attempt to get around the problem. So I think the point there is, I think Craig's response, though, while there may be some merit to it, I think there are certain problems with the way he responds to the challenges of hell. Right? Okay, so how would an annihilationist respond to these problems? So I'm going to make some tentative suggestions here. So let's look first at the challenges Raymond Bradley raises again. So let's look at A perfectly good being would not torture anyone for any period whatever. So let's suppose you grant that this is a non-negotiable moral principle. If hell is everlasting destruction and not everlasting misery or agony, then believing in hell doesn't require you to believe that God is punishing people for torture or anything like it. So this just doesn't apply if you interpret the passages that way. To have a bite against an annihilationist conception of hell, you would need to replace A with something like this. A perfectly good being would never punish anyone with the death penalty. And I already argued earlier, that does not seem to me to be a morally non-negotiable principle. That doesn't seem to be the kind of principle a person could, cannot coherently attribute to a loving and just God, right? That seems to be more of a kind of moral principle that you might say is controversial, and you could say that you can coherently say that a loving and just God can do, right? So I think that annihilationism can address A fairly straightforwardly, and it's not caught up with the problem Craig has of trying to interpret these as metaphors for some kind of suffering, and at the same time saying that it's nothing like torture, but it's a metaphor for something like torture, right? What about the second problem, the disproportionality issue, the idea that a just being wouldn't punish someone eternally for the sins committed during a brief lifetime, but would proportion the punishment to the offence? Can annihilationism deal with this? Well, Sean Boelski says that it can't, and here's the argument he gives. I've put it out on the text there. He says the only way annihilationists can get around this problem is to deny that hell is everlasting, right? And of course, I've already defended the claim that they don't hold that, right? This is what he says: if annihilationism is an infinite punishment, then to resolve the disproportionality problem, the annihilationist must argue that a certain type of infinite punishment, that which ends in annihilation, notice the way he phrases it, but leave that alone, that a certain type of infinite punishment, that's what ends in annihilation is a just sentence for sin of finite seriousness, despite the punishment being in fact infinite. Presumably this will be done by attempting to link the disproportion to something other than the infinite nature of the punishment. And the most likely candidate is everlasting conscious existence. If annihilation is an infinite punishment, it's not obvious that extinction is a genuinely lesser and more proportionate punishment than that of the traditional view. Assuming there is some valid analogy, there is no consensus as to which is more severe, life imprisonment or capital punishment. If annihilationism is a lesser punishment, the annihilationist needs to argue this point pervasively, and I have not encountered any to this effect. Right? So there's really two claims here. So let me summarise the two claims he makes here. If annihilationism is everlasting punishment, he thinks the only morally relevant difference between traditionalism and annihilationism is that traditionalism involves everlasting conscious existence, right? And secondly, the mere existence of an absence of conscious existence should make no difference to the severity of the punishment. Now, I just think both these claims are mistaken. So let's look at the first one. He seems to overlook a fairly obvious issue, and that is that the traditional view of hell involves not just conscious existence, but everlasting conscious suffering, not everlasting conscious torment, right? And it's interesting, Boelski, in the article he writes in this, he offers a kind of model of hell where he plays that aspect of it down. But in the footnotes, he criticises annihilationists for not taking seriously the passages about torment in the Book of Revelation. So he sort of says annihilationism is problematic. It doesn't take seriously these pictures of torment in the Book of Revelation. So in a more extended version, I sort of said, well, hang on, if you're going to play this up, then you can't say that this isn't part of the traditional view, right? Anyway. So, and obviously the presence and absence of suffering is relevant to the severity of a punishment, right? And a similar oversight occurs in the second point here, right? The idea that the mere absence of conscious existence makes no difference to the severity of a punishment. Bawalski asks his readers, which is more severe, life imprisonment or capital punishment? Well, actually, the answer to that question actually depends on the details, right? It depends quite crucially on the kind of imprisonment being envisaged. You know, if you put me under lifelong house arrest at my father's mansion at Mount Maunganui, a life sentence would be significantly less severe than capital punishment, right? I wouldn't quite mind that punishment, actually, all right? However, if hell is something like everlasting conscious suffering, if that's what you're envisaging, you know, then readers are being asked to compare capital punishment with a life of intense misery and agony. A better analogy then is someone being imprisoned in the Tower of London, being perpetually tortured, or perhaps being isolated in solitary confinement without respite, without any source of joy, comfort, or even distraction, right? And under conditions like that, life imprisonment, the idea that life imprisonment is less severe than capital punishment is surely questionable, right? People in conditions like that, by the way, tend to kill themselves. And it becomes implausible if such conditions were extenuated out to eternity, right? So Bawalski seems to only be able to make this argument because he makes the traditional view just be about conscious existence without any kind of filling in the details about the nature of that existence, right? So I think Bawalski doesn't make his case here. So here's the question: how do annihilationists address the disproportionality question? Well, here's what I want to suggest. The annihilationists can accept P1, P2, P3, and P4, all without entailing that God is unjust. And he can do so on this assumption, the phrase everlasting punishment in P3 does not mean everlasting conscious suffering. Rather, P3 means only that the penalty itself lasts forever. There is no implication that the experience of being punished is everlasting, or that the process of being punished lasts forever. And once this is granted, the crucial inference you see that I put in C1 there is invalid. Because notice what's said there. The first premise, P1, states that the severity of the punishment must be proportionate to the seriousness of the crime. P2 states that no infinite lifetime of human sins is infinitely serious. These premises entail that it would be disproportionate to punish human sins with an infinitely severe punishment. But it doesn't follow that it can't be punished with a resultant penalty that is everlasting. This conflates the idea that a penalty lasts forever with the idea that the penalty is infinitely or maximally severe. Notice the difference, the idea that the resultant penalty lasts forever with the idea that the penalty is infinitely or maximally severe. Is there a difference? Yes, here's an example designed to illustrate the difference. Imagine Hitler exterminates all the Jews, wins World War II, kills millions, eliminates all his political opponents. He retires from German politics and dies at a ripe old age. He is without remorse and enjoys his twilight years spending a sizable fortune he has amassed from his crimes. He dies and comes before the judgment seat of God and is admitted into eternity of bliss, subject to one penalty. He is banned from using the spa pool in the 6-star mansion in which he resides. The penalty is everlasting. He is forever denied access to the spa pool. Right? Now, is this too severe for Hitler's lifetime of crimes? Right? No, right? Obviously it is not, right? This is not too severe for Hitler's lifetime of crimes. In fact, it isn't severely enough. It's certainly not infinitely severe. But notice it's an everlasting punishment. Right? So the severity of a punishment is not a function of its duration. It depends on the experienced suffering involved. So unless one assumes an everlasting punishment involves intense conscious suffering, the crucial inference in this argument is false, right? And in fact, the answer to this was actually proposed thousands of years ago by Augustine of Hippo, who was a defender of the traditional view. Augustine of Hippo, in his book The City of God, explained that to be proportional, to say that a punishment is proportionate to the crime does not mean that the duration of the punishment must match the duration of the crime. Someone might spend 120 seconds holding up a convenience store with a gun, destroying some of the property, hitting someone over the head with a pistol, stealing the money in the register, and they may receive several years or months in prison for this, right? Justly. And Augustine also recognised that there were penalties in his day that last forever that could be justly imposed for some crimes. He gave the example of banishment. If a person was permanently banished from their country, they could never return to their country of origin. Of course, the people subject to such penalties do not live forever, and they do not consciously experience the induced anguish. However, the penalty itself, the exclusion from their home country, lasts forever. They never return. That such punishments are everlasting in this sense does not mean that serious crimes cannot warrant them. And Augustine pointed this out when people of his day said sins committed in a finite lifetime can never warrant an eternal crime. Okay. Similarly, it does not mean there cannot be a just penalty for a finite but enormous number of sins, each taking a finite amount of time committed over a finite lifetime. So think of it that way. Think of let's say I live for 80 years or 90 years, how many finite sins I commit in my lifetime. Is it plausible that if you added them all together, they couldn't all add up to be sufficiently severe to warrant a everlasting crime, if you define everlasting punishment simply in terms of the punishment that is everlasting in the sense I'm talking about. Suppose one understands the phrase everlasting punishment to mean only that whatever penalty is inflicted is itself everlasting. In that case, it is not a non-negotiable principle that human sins cannot warrant an everlasting punishment. So I've prattled on for too long there, but basically hopefully it gives you an idea of the scope of the paper that I wrote. And my point is this: I think that annihilationism provides a better answer to these philosophical challenges than traditional view. I hope I've sketched something of the kind of challenges atheist philosophers raise. I've given a representative traditionalist answer. I've shown why I think there are problems with it, and I've shown why I think annihilationists give a better answer. So I'll leave you with that.